This is a production of Cornell University.
Slide and jump right into urban ecosystems. And I think that they are extremely important for a number of reasons. And a lot of those reasons are pretty well documented and well known in the general public, right? We think about things like human-nature interactions or ecosystem services like flood control, pollution remediation, but also things like food production and urban farms, community gardens, food security. These are things that are pretty well documented. I would say most people agree upon the value of them. But there is another service and value to these urban ecosystems that I would argue are not as well documented, and that is their role that they play in biodiversity. So urban ecosystems are, in fact, quite rich in their biodiversity, even though sometimes we tend to overlook them. And it's important that we understand the patterns and processes of our urban biodiversity as such. And just to kind of highlight an example of that, there's this great study done by Ingo Kerouac's lab over in Berlin. And he surveyed plant communities in a lot of different habitat types, whether it be kind of like classic parks or some sort of green space, or what he calls these novel ecosystems, like these streetscapes, right? And in this survey, he identified over 1,000 different populations of 200 endangered plant species, all living within Berlin. And so this is not what we typically think of when we think of urban ecosystems. However, these novel ecosystems in our cities can actually support a wide range of endangered and biodiverse ecosystems. And so they are extremely rich, and they are unique in their biodiversity. However, they can suffer from reduced heterogeneity. And so because we like a certain suite of species, maybe we really like certain flowers or certain trees that provide ecosystem services, we tend to plant the same thing over and over again, and that leads to homogenization. So even if it is rich at the local patch level, if it is repeating over and over again, the overall city is not going to be very biodiverse, right? And this idea of homogenization in urban areas was first proposed a couple of decades ago. And there are basically two ideas within this hypothesis. And the first one is within city homogenization, which basically predicts that as we increase with urbanization, so too does homogenization. The more and more urban you get, the more and more similar your communities are. And then the other idea is across cities. Basically, 2 or 3 independent, unconnected cities should have highly similar plant and animal communities within them, right? And like I said, this is a concern for biodiversity, of course, right? So even if in our urban areas we have higher levels of alpha diversity, if there is no turnover, no change patch to patch, then our beta diversity is low, and then our overall biodiversity in our cities can be reduced as a function of that, right? So that's a big concern for biodiversity, but it's also a concern for human-nature interactions. So there's this really interesting study that recently came out where they looked at homogenization of urban form. So this is looking at things like urban planning, architecture, design. And they find that, this big synthesis found that when there is homogenization of urban form, people tend to lower their effective bounds to places and reduce their intentions to engage with their neighborhood. So if it's the same thing over and over again, it doesn't feel special, and we don't want to engage with those areas, right? This is, of course, very well exemplified by the SpongeBob SquarePants episode, if anyone is familiar, yeah? Where Squidward moves to Squidville because it is this cultivated landscape of what he considers beautiful. However, it is the same thing over and over and over again, as you can see from the picture, right? It's the same thing, and we grow to hate it. There is no novelty, there is no uniqueness, and so it has very little value to us, in effect. And so I think it is very important that we identify areas where we find biotic heterogeneity in our cities, and then also that we promote that heterogeneity. So not only where does it naturally occur, what kind of habitats, what kind of species, but also how do we maintain and introduce that so that we can manage our urban ecosystems, not just for beauty and aesthetic, but also for biodiversity and heterogeneity, right? So that kind of gets into what we'll be talking about today. The first kind of approach we're going to take a look at is where do we find heterogeneity? So what are the taxa that exhibit increased beta diversity? What habitat types might host high degrees of turnover, change from patch to patch? And then secondly, we'll talk about processes. So what processes may generate heterogeneity, and how can we manage them to support unique, novel habitats and communities in our urban ecosystems, right? So that's how we'll break things up. We'll start off with finding heterogeneity, and then we'll get into generating heterogeneity. And to talk about finding heterogeneity, we'll talk about some of my previous work in community gardens. And I think that community gardens are a really interesting, really cool ecosystem type or habitat type that is a little bit overlooked. But there's been a lot of recent research into that, into groups over at Chicago Botanical Gardens or in the West Coast, or the previous lab that I was in, Monica Edgerer's lab over in Germany, has been doing a lot of this recent work as well. And they're super interesting systems because they have this really high diversity of both cultivated and spontaneous biodiversity. So we, of course, are planting in vegetables, flowers, crops, the things that we want to grow. But because it is this kind of community-style allotment gardening, it gets pretty messy. And there is a lot of spontaneous diversity that pops up in these gardens as well, right? And so we can have this nice mix of purposely planted species and then naturally occurring habitats and species, right? Additionally, these gardens are really heterogeneous in terms of the gardeners who make up those spaces. If you've ever worked in or been a part of a community garden, you know that it could be a sitcom, right? The personalities are big, there are arguments, and there are differences from patch to patch, right? And those motivations and gardener practices are going to create differences in the types of species that can live in these gardens, right? And then, of course, we can study this across very different landscapes, highly urban, suburban, different types of cities, to understand how that influences the communities as well. And so because of all of this variability in management practices, people, habitat types, we predict that they should show very high levels of beta diversity or heterogeneity in our system, right? So this is an area that we should look for when we're searching for heterogeneity in our cities. And so we come back to that urban biotic homogenization hypothesis. And we want to ask, do we find evidence for this hypothesis in urban community gardens? And if so, for who? For which taxa, right? So more specifically, we're taking a look here at the plant communities in these gardens. And we ask the first question, within city homogenization, do plant communities become increasingly similar as we increase with urbanization? And then secondly, across cities. If we look at communities in community gardens across independent cities, are they more similar to each other than they are to, say, rural or natural areas? So to do this, we took a look at 33 community gardens in the cities of Berlin and Munich, two large German cities. And we surveyed the plant communities for the past 4 years, surveying them multiple times per year. And we did this with simple 1 by 1 meter subplots where we're taking a look at the plants in there. As you can see, sometimes it's very spontaneous, sometimes it's very cultivated, sometimes it's very urban, right? But we took a look at these plants, and I have to say that it was a great time to be working with this group. The beauty of urban ecology is that you can stop at a bar after you're finished with work, right? And so Monica's lab is a really, really fun team, really happy to be working with them. We're still doing some work together today. But getting back to the surveys, all of the individuals were categorized as cultivated or spontaneous or wild, right? And a species could be both depending on the context. This is one example of rattlesnake master is a species that we use in a lot of restorations. We purposefully plant it. But here it is, of course, popping up in the cracks of a driveway, very much not purposefully planted. And so this species in this context is spontaneous, for example. So we took all this data and then we calculated beta diversity at both the survey and garden level, calculated urbanization or percent sealed surface around these gardens, and got their community composition. Now, importantly, we did this for the full community, and then we split this out by wild species or wild individuals, and then wild or cultivated ones as well, to see if there was differences between those taxa types, right? So if we think about this UBH hypothesis, we should predict to see something like this, right? Where as we increase with urbanization, we should see beta diversity dropping off. Now, whether that relationship is linear or there's some sort of tipping point, doesn't really matter. We should just see a negative relationship here, right? And what we see is actually no such thing. So we see that as urbanization increases, beta diversity at both the survey and garden level does not have any significant drop-off. And I want to say importantly here, we range from 9% urban to 95% urban. So we cover the entire gradient here pretty well in both of our cities. Now, if we break this out by species, what we can see is that the wild individuals actually increase their heterogeneity with urbanization. So these communities are more heterogeneous, more different from one another in the urban areas than they are in the surrounding rural areas. Among cultivated species, we don't see any such relationship at all. So no support for this UBH hypothesis, what we find here within a city, right? Now, our second question, across two cities. What about the differences between Berlin and Munich, right? And here we have an NMDS showing community composition. Our blue points are Berlin, red is Munich, and then the darker colors for both cities is the urban sites. And what we see is that there is some overlap between our two sites, but these two cities do statistically diverge significantly. They are different communities, and very much importantly to the UBH hypothesis, we see that the urban gardens are much more similar to the rural gardens than they are to the other urban of the other city, right? In direct opposition to this UBH hypothesis once again. So we do see this strong differentiation between our cities. If we break this out by species again, we see something interesting where the wild or spontaneous individuals are diverging quite a bit. However, among cultivated species, it's always the same. So when we are planting species in these spaces, it is always the exact same, whether it's urban, rural, Berlin, Munich, it doesn't matter. We see very much a homogenization occurring among cultivated species. And that's important because when we take a look at who's contributing the most to overall beta diversity, we see that beta diversity in the gardens is really being driven by our spontaneous plants, right? The R squared here is 0.85 compared to a cultivated beta diversity and overall beta diversity, the R squared is only 0.16. So we can see that in gardens that are very heterogeneous, that is a result of the spontaneous or naturally occurring biodiversity, not what we are actually doing planting in these sites, right? And these results were published earlier this year taking a look at plant communities, but I will say that we did a very similar analysis looking at pollinator communities and found similar trends. No loss of beta diversity as we increase in urbanization, and we saw a strong divergence between the pollinator communities between our two cities, right? So at both of these plant and pollinator levels, we're seeing this divergence. And so I think that's valuable because it shows that urban community gardens can be these unique ecological communities, very heterogeneous, and they can be different between these two city types, right? And part of that makes total sense to me because Berlin and Munich are very different cities, right? Munich is known as kind of the wealthier city in Germany. I would call it the HOA city. They love their rules. They love their clean lines, right? So a lot of their space is very heavily cultivated, very managed. Don't get me wrong, English Garden is one of the best urban parks in the world, I think. But this is very different from Berlin, which has a very different culture. It has also this classic East Berlin, West Berlin history that a lot of us know about. That introduced a lot of heterogeneity into their system. And they just have this very different association with wild biodiversity. Most of their urban trees, whether it be parks or street trees, are not trimmed because they know the value of snags and dead branches for biodiversity. This is ingrained in their management practices at the city level. And that is why in Berlin we see all these rare species popping up. There is this very strong tolerance for spontaneous wild biodiversity in Berlin specifically that Munich culturally just does not have the same tolerance for. And so getting back to this, we can imagine we have these two cities, they have their centroids that are separate from each other like this, right? But we can imagine zooming out and thinking at a much larger scale, we can imagine these two cities fitting into different typologies, right? Different types of cities. Berlin and Munich may be separate, but they may be fitting into other cities that have similar cultural values, city designs, urban planning structures that would then predict ecological community compositions, right? And so this is something that's been done previously in mobility sciences, where they study things like transit ridership, bike share, walkability, traffic patterns, and they can build these urban typologies or common city forms that we see. And so they can do these analyses to say we have these different types of cities that predict mobility. And our group is now trying to see if we can do the same thing with biodiversity. Are there a suite of factors that we can collect data on and put into a model to say, these are the typologies of cities that will predict contemporary biodiversity? And we can look at that at a lot of different angles, whether it be taxonomic, functional, certain taxa, or street trees that are cultivated versus forest trees that are spontaneous, right? There's a lot of ways we can break this down, but this is going to be a pretty big area of focus for us in the coming years, thinking about these different typologies and urban forms that are going to influence biodiversity. So, like I said, we can have this divergence between our cities, and I would argue that a lot of that is based on these differences in typology, right? Not all cities are the same. And in fact, we did not see any loss with urbanization as well. And this is some data from another study that we are working on that is not yet published, but we collected the same types of data across tons of urban community gardens across Europe. And what we find is that similarity in the plant community is not related to similarity in their urbanization values, but instead related to how they manage those gardens. So what are your watering rules, weeding, herbicide, all these different types of management rules. The more similar you manage it, the more similar your plant communities are. So this indicates that the human hand plays a very, very big role, and it's not just that urban areas are always going to be the same over and over again. Our management practices do play an important role, right? And then, of course, that means we should be supporting these spontaneous plants. These are the ones actually driving heterogeneity, introducing beta diversity, and those are the ones that are responding to the urban typology. The different forms create different patterns, and therefore different meta-communities for these spontaneous plants, right? And so I think that shows it's really important that we support these spontaneous plants. And that's going to be some work that we're doing in the future as well, working in New York City gardens. A lot of Monica's previous work found that gardens with more spontaneous plants actually led to more pollination and more fruit set in the garden. So more tomatoes, more peppers when you have these spontaneous or sometimes called weedy plants, right? And so now we're going to be doing the same. Instead, we're looking at wasps and the prey that they eat. So how many caterpillars are they eating, spiders, other things like that, to get an idea of this same sort of pattern. Do we see that affecting other areas of the ecosystem? And then I think it's also important to think about these spontaneous plants not as weeds, but as biodiversity, right? There's this other great study from Kevin Vega over in Zurich, and he looked at plant communities in large urban green spaces, medium-sized, and small, or I would even call like these micro habitats. And he found that while these small habitats made up a tiny proportion of our overall green space in our cities, they contribute just as much, if not more, to beta diversity and species richness in our cities. So these are extremely valuable habitats that we should not be overlooking or taking for granted because they introduce heterogeneity into our systems. So we're going to be doing some projects, doing a little bit of guerrilla gardening and planting in some of our native species into these overlooked habitats into cities to see if they can introduce heterogeneity as well. So that is how we are talking about finding heterogeneity. We talked a little bit about future projects. We're going to be generating heterogeneity. But for this back half here, we're really going to be focusing on these urban wildfires that recently happened in New York City. And to kick that off, just a quick little story. So my collaborator, Kane, and I were writing this paper this time last year, about how invasive species management in urban areas is really difficult. We have a lot of high propagule pressure, invasives are always coming in, and once they establish, it's really hard to pull us out of that valley and push us over to, say, a native-dominated state. And part of that difficulty is that we don't have the same management tools available to us, right? Like herbicides are very much frowned upon in urban areas. Additionally, we say prescribed burns are basically impossible in urban areas, right? So that is just another tool in our toolkit that is unavailable to manage invasives and operate in our cities. And this paper was written or published in October of last year, and then 2 weeks later, New York City burns. So I'm not sure if you all remember this, but this time last year, there was a 2-acre fire in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and then 1 week later, there was a 12-acre wildfire in Inwood Hill Park in Manhattan. And so, of course, to a lot of local residents, this was, quote, devastating. To me, this was very exciting as a research opportunity, right? So much so that I emailed Howard, the head of Prospect Park, at 4 a.m. I guess I should calm down a little bit with my emails, but regardless, I thought it was a very exciting research opportunity to jump in and understand how this is affecting our urban ecosystems. And part of the novelty of this is that urban burns are extremely rare, and especially a burn within an entirely isolated, independent forest patch, right? We are seeing increasing burns that start in wildland areas and creep into suburban areas, but almost unheard of to have an entirely independent urban isolated patch have a sort of fire like this. And so I think that's really important because independent forest patches have different seed banks, different pollinators, different herbivores, different microclimates. A previous study that we did, we looked at plant fitness, and we find that fitness is different in our urban ecosystems, right? And so all of these factors are going to influence the successional trajectory and the responses to these fires. What we have observed in natural ecosystems is not necessarily going to mirror what happens in our urban ecosystems, so we need to understand what is happening to predict out into the future, right? So these things like plant fitness, pollinator communities, floral phenology, these are all different in our urban areas and may influence the response to the fire as a result. So broadly, we're asking here and investigating the ecological responses to these wildfires. And we're doing that in a lot of different ways. One way we're looking at is the herbaceous plant community, taking a look at native, non-native plant communities, pollinators as well. Most of these fires were in the understory tree community, so they went through that understory. I think across all 14 acres, we only had 6 crown trees die. So it really was not one of these crown fires. It was kind of perfect from a prescribed burn perspective in that sense. So we're taking a look just at the understory trees, and then also restoration efforts, because those have begun in one of our parks. So of course, to get back to the theme of the talk, right, we want to understand how do these spontaneous processes, like spontaneous wildfires, impact our plant and insect communities? Did these fires introduce heterogeneity? And then what the city really cares about is, do these fires reduce the risk of future uncontrolled burns, right? So our study system is New York, and down here we have Prospect Park in Brooklyn. It's a beautiful park. It's kind of like Brooklyn's Central Park, I would say. And then all the way up here in Harlem, we have Inwood Hill Park. It is actually a remnant forest, so it existed and has stood the test of time all of these centuries. And so it's a really, really cool, interesting park as well. In Prospect Park, we have our little burned area here, and then we're monitoring an unburned area just right next to it of a similar size as well. In Inwood Hill Park, we actually have 2 separate burns, and one of them you can see here is at the top of the hill, and the other one, much larger, is on the slope of this hill, so quite a bit different topography. So we wanted to take a look at both of them. And in both, again, we have our unburned sites paired to go with it to understand the responses here. So we did surveys in April, June, August, and October. And when we went out there, we surveyed the herbaceous plant community in simple 1x1 meter subplots, very similar to what you saw in the community gardens. We conducted pollinator observations, and then we also looked at that understory tree community. And then just recently in October, we looked at coarse woody debris, fine woody debris. We collected leaf litter and also took some soil cores as well to take a look at the soil responses there. So the team is a really, really great team of people. We have Howard, who is the forest ecologist at Prospect Park. He has really great knowledge of that system and has been a huge, huge help. Also brought along some couple of interns who helped out with data collection in the summertime. Lydia Paradiso is also a postdoc joining my lab. She did a lot of this research in the field. And then Kane, my collaborator, who you saw on that recent paper, he has a lot of expertise in prescribed burning, and so it's great to have his expertise here. So let's take a look at results, right? We have 4 different results here, and these are just the data from April. But you can see we have burned and unburned. No surprise, we have a dramatic reduction in litter depth. The fires kind of burned off everything that was on the forest floor. We're starting to see some revegetation happen in April. Species are popping up. And then, of course, the really exciting, most dramatic data point we have here is that in our burned areas, we're averaging 90 to 100% native species popping up, these native plants. And in our unburned areas, it's averaging around 0% native species. So this huge, just total stable state switch from invasive dominated to native dominated in our burned areas. So this is April. Same thing in June here. You can see native species still dominating in our burned areas. In our unburned areas, we still have an invasive species dominating. Now we have some poison ivy popping up, which is, of course, just lovely. We also see that the species richness is creeping up quite a bit higher in our burned areas compared to unburned. And then in August, again, the pattern is holding higher species richness, dominance of native species compared to our unburned sites. October, we just collected it, so we'll get to that eventually, right? So we see these generic responses here, but then also, of course, our question here today is about heterogeneity, right? So once again, we're going to take a look at an NMDS. Here our red points are burned and our blue points are unburned. And you can see that these burn sites are basically opening up a new community composition type, right? This is a different type of native dominated community that is different from our unburned sites here. We have a few sites over here that I don't think actually really got burned that hard, and now they are kind of resembling the unburned sites. But in general, we are opening up this new type of community over here that is unique and different. So that was all the data of the herbaceous plant communities. We also have data, like I said, on the understory trees. Here again, we have burned, unburned. And what you can see is that the forest had about an 85% mortality rate, right? Where there was a pretty heavy reduction in our dead trees. Now this gray, sorry, is just standing dead. And so we have a dramatic drop in our standing live trees in the forest understory. If you zoom in on this, I think it's kind of interesting, the species that survived. It is a lot of black cherry and other species like this as well. And I don't want to read too much into this, of course, but there is a pretty interesting study from the 1970s where Robert Loeb was taking a look at recent forest fires in the Bronx. New York City in the 70s had a very different relationship to its parks. It was a little bit in a period of disrepair. In this picture, you can see the fire, but there's also an overturned car in the forest, right? It was just kind of like a dump site. And Robert went out, did kind of the exact same thing that I'm doing now, 3 different fires, burned, unburned. And what he noticed was that oak, sassafras, and black cherry were the main things popping back up in his sites. And we are seeing the exact same pattern today. We're seeing oaks, sassafras, and black cherry popping up in response to this fire. So I think this is a really interesting sign, and kind of the next step then would be to investigate what the patterns look like in his burns 50 years on today, right? So we'll be doing that in the coming years as well. These are the data from the Inwood Hill. I have not had time to really process them yet, but we'll be getting around to them. Again, very interesting to see this shift in that overstory tree community years and years on, right? Pollinator data. So here we pooled all of our pollinator data across surveys. Again, we have burned and unburned, and here we see a huge difference in pollinator abundance, right? We have this split out into different functional groups of pollinators, but regardless, you can see across all of them, we see this huge explosion of pollinators in our burned areas as composed to very, very little pollinator abundance in these unburned forest patches, right? So a major difference there as well. So in summary, these burns have a lot of positive benefits that we're observing in our ecosystems, right? These burns shifted our communities from an invasive dominated stable state to a native dominated state. Now, not to say that is a stable state, but we are seeing a lot of native species popping up, right? We created these new novel assemblages, these different communities, and increased species richness, at least temporarily, right? Both among plants and pollinators. Additionally, we significantly reduced leaf litter across the season, and we had this major understory tree mortality event, which is going to then change the succession of this forest as well, because it will change the overstory trees in years to come. More work that needs to be done is on the soils. So I know I'm giving a talk to the soils group, so sorry to not have those data for you guys, but we will be taking a look at nutrient loads, pH, as well as soil microbial communities to see if those changed from our burned and unburned areas. Next year, we'll be taking a look at canopy cover and then the effects of restoration, because Prospect Park has a quite large budget compared to Inwood Hill Park. They've been able to do some restorations, and our other sites are a little bit slower on that. But next year, we're going to be going out doing surveys again. I think we'll take a look at the insect communities a little bit more closely next year, depending on bandwidth, but that is another area that we'd love to take a look at as well. So across all of these data points, what we see is that these burns provided a lot of value, right? One thing they did was they reduced the fuel load. There is now less stuff to be burnt on the forest floor. And that's really important and really obvious. As you can see from our pictures, here was our surveys in April. This is the burn sites. You can see we basically just have a bunch of acorn husks. And in our unburned sites, we have this thick blanket of Vinca minor, a lot of coarse woody debris, some leaf litter in there, ripe for a burn. And that is very important because last year we saw a huge major drought in New York. And then this year, if you recall, late summer was very, very hot, very, very dry. This is the future that New York is facing. And so while the idea of wildfires and burns, we consider that California's problem, increasingly, I think we're going to start seeing that as an East Coast problem as well. And so it's important that we manage for that accordingly. Additionally, we saw that these fires did great things for invasive species management. Like I have been hammering, we're shifting that over to a native-dominated state, so great things for invasive species. We are introducing ecological novelty. We're opening up a new community type. I will just say also these burn scars on the trees are very cool looking, and I do think that they add some nice novelty, uniqueness to the city landscape as well. And so all of this together makes me push for the argument that I think we should be burning New York City parks, right? This is a tough sell, I have been told. Apparently the fire department is not gonna love this, but that is kind of the next step. We are having these conversations with New York City Parks. Parks Department is on board, fire department, we'll see. And so that's gonna be a big push of the next few years, trying to get some prescribed burns done in the city, trying to understand if that's going to generate similar ecological responses to what we already know about in natural areas, right? Does it influence biodiversity the same, fuel load, tree regeneration? All of these things may differ in our urban ecosystems. Of course, to do this, we need to know if we are allowed to do this. Do we have the social construct to operate, right? And so we just received a small grant from Cornell to do some perception surveys on these fires, to understand how people feel about these, if they think it is a good idea, what their prescribed or perceived benefits and costs are of this, and relating that to previous knowledge or relationship to the park. Do you know what prescribed burns are? How often do you visit the park? How often do you volunteer at the park? Because what we're finding is when we have conversations with park managers and volunteer groups, they love it. They're all on board. And then when I talk to my friends who work in regular jobs that don't have to do with science, they don't even know what a prescribed burn is, and that sounds terrifying to them. So trying to understand the communities that do and do not support these burns is going to be very important moving forward. I think that there are some really exciting sites that we could be burning in New York City. One is this really, really cool abandoned airfield in Brooklyn, Floyd Bennett Field. It has just been let go, and communities are now reestablishing on these sites. Management is pretty low, investment is pretty low, and it is also right next to the coast. So I think it's a great site to do some training, prescribed burns, maybe teaching FDNY how to do some of these practices as well. So we do have some candidate sites in mind. But across all of today's talk, I just want to say that what's really important is supporting natural ecological processes in our cities. and not hugging them to death with cultivation, right? I think it's important that we allow some spontaneity into our urban ecosystems to introduce biotic heterogeneity, novel processes, novel community compositions, right? And so these urban ecosystems can be quite heterogeneous, but of course management is important. We show that in community gardens, we show that in our urban forest patches. Across both of these habitat types, they can be very heterogeneous, but that is responsive to management practices. So I think it's valuable that we think outside the box and we allow ourselves to consider a prescribed burn in New York City. Just because it hasn't been done doesn't mean it cannot be done, right? We should value these once overlooked habitats like roadside patches that maybe we don't understand as valuable, but quantitatively we know they can support biodiversity. And then finally, thinking about wild plants, or weeds would be another word, in our agricultural ecosystems, right? These spontaneous plants can provide habitat for our other insects and therefore support agricultural production in our urban ecosystems, right? So the processes of spontaneity into our cities is extremely valuable, and the push of this lab is going to be tried to foster that spontaneity. So with that, huge thanks to the people who've helped out on this: Monica, Juan, Howard, tons and tons others. Atkinson's and Cornell has been funding some of this, and then thank you all for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
So you mentioned towards the beginning of your talk in one of the review papers that you did that prescribed burns were nearly impossible in urban areas, and then talked a little bit about the public perception. Is that the main hurdle to doing prescribed burns in urban areas, or what are kind of the challenges?
Yeah, so the question was about what is stopping us from doing prescribed burns in urban areas. Is it perception or is it other things? And I think that's a great question. I'm not yet sure. In my experience, it's been perception, or just the idea of FDNY is going to hate that, don't even try. I think that that's a big hurdle. Another one that I don't want to overlook is the smoke effect, and trying to understand where that smoke is going to go, who's that going to affect. Natural area prescribed burns are done so that they can manage where the smoke is going to go and when and all that sort of stuff. The weather is very important. It will also be important, more important in urban areas, right? And so that's why I think that the abandoned airfield out in Brooklyn is a great candidate site, because we can learn a lot about the smoke patterns in urban areas that way. And it will less likely influence direct neighbors, but that's very much an area of research that needs to happen that I don't have any clue about. So, yeah.
Thank you. Great.
Yeah, thank you very much for your exciting talk, and thanks for visiting us. I'm totally sold. I'll the burn.
Yeah,
a lot of interest in burning. In the middle of your talk, you talked about that management was actually increasing diversity, and it wasn't urbanization that puts the biggest imprint on. And now that you convinced me that burning is the way to go, are there other things that we could also do? You didn't quite get there. You said there's a big perimeter space, all of the US, but is there something you can already divulge, what other options there are?
Yeah, so the question is basically, what are the other practices in our urban areas that we can do to promote biodiversity? And I think that a lot of that has to do with, in my mind, I think about the processes. So like, what can we do to create a healthy ecosystem chain, right? So another project that we're pushing on is trying to convert turf grass into native meadows, right? Because that is going to introduce a multitude of insects, which will support a multitude of birds, which et cetera, right? So thinking about ways that we can generate habitat in areas that don't currently exist is really, really important, I think. So that's why these spontaneous plants in the garden are great. We can do the same thing in our residential landscapes that are currently somewhat homogeneous, right? We think about those turf grass suburbia, they can be pretty homogeneous. I've been really pleasantly surprised by Ithaca. I live in Fall Creek, and it's filled with native lawns. So I think that is, a nice example that we can think about. But in terms of management, the list goes on, but I really try and think about processes and like ways that we can introduce habitat, I think is the most valuable thing we can do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a management question. So I used to live in the Bay Area and in Berkeley and Tilden Park. It's a large natural area. I remember going for a run through there, and they have like understory management of like goats or sheep. They would just, you'd just be running through and then you see these little fences and they all look up and look at you.
Yep.
And I mean, because I don't want to do prescribed burns close to the city if they.
Of course.
And just from your perspective, like, is that an easier sell? Are there biodiversity selection effects? I know sheep are choosier than goats, but just thinking about other options for clearing stuff.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was about using sheep and goats as management practices in urban areas. And actually in Munich, they do the same thing. They have these little sheep corrals that they move around from patch to patch and they use them instead of mowing. And I went to Frank Rossi, he's the turf grass guy here, and I said, Frank, I think we should bring sheeps back to Sheep's Meadow in Central Park. And he laughed at me, so we will see. Again, that is a perfect example of introducing heterogeneity, right? I think it'd be really interesting to bring sheep in as a management tool. They do a really effective job of kind of grazing and reducing these things. The question always becomes human perception, human value of those practices, but I think that's exactly what you're hitting on, is like exactly what we're trying to make that push for. How do we introduce these novel management practices? How do we think outside the box? Yeah.
Do you get the sense that in second and third year in those burned areas, the invasives are going to take over, and will you need to actively manage for them? Because that's, I can guarantee you that's likely what's going to happen. So
Yeah. So the question is about second and third year, what's going to happen to these areas if they're not managed? And 100%, these invasives are going to crawl back in, right? And so Prospect Park actually has been doing a fantastic job of this. They basically used the fire as a fundraising campaign. And they got a lot of money because people thought the park was dying. And so they have done a ton of planting in of native species. They've laid down a lot of jute on the more sloped areas. And they started off with a herbaceous planting campaign. Now they're doing a like shrub, woody campaign planting. So Prospect Park is on top of it because they have the people and the budgets. Inwood Hill does not have those same resources, right? And so they have like volunteer teams that basically you can sign up to be a friend of Inwood Hill Park and you manage like a quarter acre and it's yours. And so they're trying to push some of those teams into the burned areas because it is an opportunity. And we are going to be applying to a grant next week to try and do some of those restorations in Inwood Hill specifically, and thinking about different planting regimes, seed mixes and stuff that we can fit into those forest areas. Because right now is a very much unstable state, as you mentioned, right? We could tip into native dominated or invasive dominated. So I think that this restoration is really important like right now.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering, in your first study of comparing the two parks, how you decided where to sample to avoid uncertainty related to sampling locations?
This is in the community gardens or in
Germany.
In Germany, yeah. So the question is about how we decided where to sample. Yeah. And the tricky thing about urban ecology is we try and work in as many sites as we can, and then we get kicked out of a lot of sites. Gardens get turned into parking lots, or there are other problems. Like, we are at the whims of society sometimes. So there is a lot of difficulty there. Monica did a very good job of ensuring that sites were along an urbanization gradient from very rural to very urban, and selecting those sites and basically procuring those sites along the gradient was very, very important to her. Additionally, she wanted to make sure that sites were at least 1.5 kilometers apart, because that is kind of the flight range of a lot of pollinators. So for a lot of our pollination work, that was very important. And then within the garden, it was kind of just a standard sampling design of grids, random numbers, plots go, you go where the number tells you to go, sort of thing. So, yeah.
So I go back to the beginning of your talk and at the diversity component of it. The diversity is not actually that surprising, as we know. We know there's urban environments are incredibly diverse. It's always been the abundance question and the patchiness. Do you have any sort of comments on, if we want the diversity for a variety of different environmental services, that's great for that patch. But you just mentioned that some of these patches disappear very quickly.
Yep.
How will that impact on the management side, how we should be thinking about this?
Yeah, so the question was about patchiness of these urban environments and kind of disturbance and turnover. And I will say that we are Monica and I are currently writing a paper saying death to the urban biotic homogenization hypothesis because we don't think that it's necessarily correct. And so a lot of that paper is dedicated to kind of meta-community theory, patchiness, fragmentation, all that sort of stuff. So I could go on, but I will say that the fragmentation is actually quite valuable in our urban ecosystems because it does create separation between the patches, and it ensures that there's not a constant colonization between our patches and therefore not the same thing over and over again. So the fragmentation, of course, hurts certain species, but is quite valuable from a biodiversity perspective. The disturbances and loss of habitats is really dangerous and a big issue where we are converting a community garden into a parking lot, or if we're trying to turn a parking lot into a community garden, that is much, much harder. And that has been shown to have, not as positive biodiversity benefits. And so I think it's really important that we maintain and preserve the existing patches that we have. And that's why a park like Inwood Hill Park that is a remnant forest from before Dutch colonizers is so valuable because that is going to be a different type of ecosystem than, say, a restored forest or a planting or a park, right? And so this habitat heterogeneity in terms of how we manage it with both intensity and purpose is super important as well. Yeah.
To come back again. This I find extremely interesting. Have you seen yourself getting sucked into the discussions about pollinator pathways or biodiversity corridors? I've worked a lot in the Amazon, and the corridors are incredibly important. The sort of mantra, you have to have the corridors. What you just said is exactly the opposite. We want fragmentation, not corridors. No pollinator pathway in Ithaca, but a fragmented landscape to foster biodiversity. Do you get yourself sucked in?
So
is this even relevant to the community, or talking up apple and oranges?
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting.
The question is about the value of fragmentation. And I would say I need to be very careful that someone does not construe my words to say that fragmentation is good, right? I will say that it plays an important role in generating heterogeneity, and that is very important in our urban ecosystems. I think that connectivity is always good, and it is valuable, but we don't want the same thing over and over again. And so separation between our patches is very important when we have our own unique habitat that those species can live in. So for example, I think I have a slide on this. We have a study where we're looking at pollinator communities in urban areas across the planet. And what we find is that these different habitat types support different bee communities. So for example, like our community gardens and our green roofs, here we're just showing size, support larger species than those in our natural green spaces in urban areas. And again, that heterogeneity is really important. We don't want the same plant pollinator community every single time, because at the city-wide level, which is what we really care about, that's how we maintain biodiversity. So it's a tricky pickle, but yeah.
Do you have any insight on the patch size?
Yeah, so for example, community gardens, green roofs are tiny. So to get there, you need to be a disperser who can go to all these different patches. So you're very big. To live in a natural ecosystem, you can just live inside that tiny little space itself. And so that's why we see a smaller size, we think.
So you can start partitioning the types of species that you would find.
Exactly. So they call these like site specialists versus dispersal generalists, right? And so we have this divergence not only by fragmentation, but also by size or management or all these different things, right?
Well, I'm afraid we are out of time. Let's thank Aaron one more time.
Thank you, guys.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.